I was on Elon Musk's new social media platform X for some reason. Like I'm finding more and more that this platform is just complete garbage, filled with like the most insane hot takes imaginable. You know, celebrities complaining about politics, YouTubers pretending that they're relevant, and I think above all, like geniuses trying to pretend that their hot gaming takes are relevant, right? And one of the big ones, and this is something that's been like floating around for a while, is this idea that like the that the N64, the Nintendo 64, has a small library, right? The N64 was such a disappointing console, man. It only had about 300 games. Yeah, ignoring the fact that like a lot of those games were super influential, were endlessly replayable, were super cutting edge, and were far above what everyone else was producing at the time. Yeah, just don't acknowledge, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, or Super Mario 64, or Star Fox 64, or GoldenEye, or any of that just glorious, glorious stuff that came out in the late 90s, right? Let's just ignore all of that and pretend that, like, I don't know, Croc 3D is some, like, stellar masterpiece, right? I've seen people try to argue that like, oh, Croc and the Legend of Gabo sold 3 million copies, which is about as much as Banjo-Kazooie sold. Nintendo fans only care about Banjo-Kazooie because it's a Nintendo property and they didn't get a lot of games. Like, ignoring the fact that Banjo-Kazooie is simply better than Croc, right? Simply ignoring the fact that like all these Nintendo games are still relevant to this day. Right, to this day, I'm still fighting new N64 games that I've never really played before. Stuff like Blast Corps, stuff like Harvest Moon 64, stuff like Mischief Makers, Castlevania 64, I still need to play. Like, there are a lot of N64 games out there that are great that don't get talked about a lot. And of course, there are others that I grew up with, games that I think a lot of people really underrate, right? Games like DK64 are a good example, right? Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, I think gets this a lot too, where people always pretend that like, oh, there's too many things to collect, but uh what? Like again, when you really like stop and think about the criticisms lobbied at these games, you start to realize that like it's just downplaying them because they're on the N64, right? They're downplaying them because you're not supposed to like Nintendo's N64 console, right? You're not supposed to like what Nintendo put out in that period. And this was before the internet. So I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the reputations these games have were cultivated by game journalists who, as we know now, are some of the most blatant shills on the planet, right? Like, a lot of these games do not deserve the reputation they got. And Majora's Mask, I think, is like a notable example of a game that like was harshly condemned when it first came out, only to like gain a really positive fan reception later. Like, I think there are a lot of games like that on there. Stuff like Rogue Squadron, which is heavily downplayed. Like there are like lots of examples of games that are just better on the N64 than their equivalents on other consoles, right? Just compare GoldenEye to Metal Gear Solid, right? In GoldenEye, you get like full 3D environments, you get a lot of mission variety, you have like a lot of replay value. Like what do you have in Metal Gear Solid? Like a lot of voice acting and just standing around like attacking people. Like Metal Gear Solid is nowhere near the same level of quality as GoldenEye, right? But Metal Gear Solid was shilled because it was a major PlayStation game, right? The reality was that GoldenEye was objectively better, always has been, but but that wasn't what the game journalists wanted you to believe, right? They wanted to sell you on this idea that Hideo Kojima was an auteur, game developer, and just created the very best games that existed. But in reality, they weren't that impressive. Never were. Never happened. Never were. They're okay. Like there's nothing wrong with MGS1. But like to put it on the same level of quality as like Ocarina, as Mario 64, as GoldenEye, like that's laughable, right? That's something I've always talked about, right? Just how much better the N64 games are than their PS1 game counterparts. But I realized that like although the PS1 and the PS2 are venerated to this day, um, you know, there are a lot of people who worship those games. I've been thinking a little bit lately that like, wow, the PS3 is just as worshipped, right? Because I talked about a lot about how the PS1 and the PS2 are like some of the most overrated consoles ever made. I've talked about how the Vita is a disaster, how the PSP is like failed, right? I talked about that, but I kind of realized that like, wow, The PS3 was a complete disaster for Sony, right? It was the console that basically killed their brand. It sunk all the profits they made in the first two consoles, right? It had no games. There was nothing out on it. Like the problems we're dealing with now with the PS5, all of that started with the PS3 generation, right? It was entirely the PS3's fault that modern game devs went in this direction, right? And I acknowledged that on X. I talked about this, like, wow, the N64 has more games than the PS3, and I was really surprised at how many people religiously disputed that idea. Like out of just pure blind fanboyism. Like, no, the PS3 was way better. It has like 5,000 games. All those games are shovelware. Oh, but even if you account for that, it still has more games. There's nothing good on PS3. Like, I own a PS3. I know what I'm talking about. Nothing on PS3 has stood the test of time the way that the N64 games have, right? The PS3 lost so many money. It doesn't have good games. And the only reason that people defend it the way they do is is that a blind fanboy loyalty to Sony, a blind fanboy loyalty to PlayStation, like a refusal to acknowledge that, games like Ratchet and Clank, like The Last of Us, Uncharted, Killzone, Infamous, like none of these games were very good to begin with, right? But we're supposed to believe these are like some top tier first party Sony exclusives until like The Last of Us Part 2 came out. Like, I really think there was a persistent narrative that Sony's exclusives, their first party developers, were the best in the industry, right? Especially during the PS3 generation, right? That was specifically the reason why I chose to get a PS3 rather than an Xbox 360, because so many people told me that, like, oh, the exclusives are way better. And I've come to realize now as an adult, someone who went back and played Gears of War, played Halo, played Ninja Gaiden Black, like have played all this stuff, Dead or Alive, like I realized that like no, PS3's exclusives were not as good as what an Xbox 360 was getting at the time. It was not as good as what Wii's were getting at the time, right? The only reason people were saying Uncharted and The Last of Us were something great was because they really had nothing else, right? It was pure game journalist fueled propaganda, right? It had no real basis in reality. People don't actually like these games. They only say they do because they have nothing else to play, right? Like that is the reality of the PS3 generation. And now that we're in like a more open society in which we can kind of talk about this stuff and like kind of address it, like, Days Gone wasn't as good as The Last of Us. Because game journalists made the mistake of hyping up The Last of Us as the best thing ever, right? What happened, right? When that studio went down, it took every single other PlayStation subsidiary down with it, right? Every single PlayStation game is trying to be The Last of Us, right? But none of it is really coming together. Not even The Last of Us's sequel could live up to like the hype of the original Last of Us, right? Like PlayStation finally reached a point where their audience was so blindly devoted to the old stuff that they couldn't even process this idea that the new stuff was better than it, right? And there are people who are trying to push that idea, right? Neil Druckmann came out and tried to say that like, oh, this is going to be my this next project is going to be my last game ever, right? And there are plenty of people like defending him, like, oh, he made like the best games ever, but like, most people are clowning on him, right? Like the reality is Neil Druckmann is not a talent in the gaming industry. Like he will not be missed. He's not going to produce anything spectacular. He's done, right? Not that he was ever here to begin with, but what were like what we've seen over the past like several years, the past decade, is just this very slow decline of the reputation of the PlayStation platforms. And right now it feels like the only thing keeping it all together is like just people just worshiping these brands, like why exactly was Spider-Man 2 pushed so hard as a Game of the Year contender, right? You saw all these like man children like clutching their Spider-Man dolls, like, Spider-Man's gonna win. Like they tried like really hard to push this idea that like Spider-Man was competitive last year, but it wasn't. We all know Mario Wonder was better. We all knew The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom was better. Like Spider-Man was in no way, shape, and form relevant, right? But it was but people really tried to pretend it was simply because of the PlayStation exclusivity.